Good afternoon. Let's start chapter 16, which is about spinal cord. The spinal cord is attached to the rest of your body through the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve has two important functions. The first function of a spinal nerve is creating a pathway to take the sensory information in or take motor impulse out. So a spinal nerve is going to bring the information inside the spinal cord, or is going to take the order from the spinal cord out. And the second function for a spinal nerve is creating spinal reflexes. An example for this one would be knee jerk reflex. When you look at the spinal cord, this is the front of the spinal cord, of course the back of the spinal cord. You can see your spinal cord is composed of two parts, the white matter, which is in the outside, and gray matter, which is inside. There are two grooves inside the spinal cord. One is in the front, and that is called anterior median fissure. The other one in the back is called posterior median sulcus. Also, we divide the spinal cord based on different segments. A cervical part of the spinal cord, thoracic part of the spinal cord. We have lumbar part of the spinal cord, and then we have sacral part of the spinal cord. But realize the lumbar part of the spinal cord and sacral part of the spinal cord is in the upper part of the lumbar part of the spinal column. Why is that? Because technically your spinal cord ends by L1 or L2 maximum. So spinal cord doesn't go all the way down. Spinal cord is going to end somewhere here. However, the nerve that comes out of the spinal cord is going to continue and get out from the spinal column. So the actual spinal cord ends around L1 and L2. The last portion of a spinal cord is called conus medullaris. Conus medullaris is really the last part of the spinal cord, yet still a spinal nerve is going to come out of the spinal cord. It's going to create a shape that it looks like a tail of a horse. That's why it's called cauda equina. Cauda equina is a bunch of spinal nerve that's coming from the end of a spinal cord. So realize lumbar part and sacral part, they are not in the lumbar or sacral region of the spinal column, but they are in the upper part of lumbar section. In this picture, you can see your spinal cord inside the spinal column. And also, you can see that the spinal cord is going to end here. And after that, we have a spinal nerve that is called cauda equina. But now the question is, if you have a spinal cord inside the spinal column, then how come this spinal column is not going to swing? How come a spinal cord stay stable inside the spinal column, and when you're walking or you're running is not going to swing and hitting the wall of the spinal column? Well, the answer is your spinal cord inside the spinal column is fixed, so it's not going to move. One of the reasons that spinal cord is fixed and is not going to move because from the end of this spinal cord, which is conus medullaris, there's the extension of the pia mater that's going to come all the way down, and as you can see in this picture, is going to attach to the coccyx. This cord, this pia mater that attaches your spinal cord to the coccyx is called the filum terminal. This filum terminal is one of the reasons that the spinal cord is going to stay stable inside the spinal column. Also in this picture, realize that you have some enlargement in different part of the spinal cord. Do you see this enlargement here? And do you see this enlargement here? The first enlargement is called cervical enlargement because it happens at the cervical region. And the next one happens in the lumbar region. It's called lumbar enlargement. Some books, they call this one lumbosacral enlargement because remember, lumbar part and sacral part, they are very close to each other. So therefore, some books, they call this one as a lumbosacral enlargement. A spinal cord is attached to the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve has two segments. One segment of the spinal nerve is coming from the back of the spinal cord, and that is the one that carries sensory impulse. So all the sensory is going to come to the spinal nerve, and then it's going to take the posterior route and it's going to get inside the spinal cord. And then all the motor one, they're going to leave the anterior part of the spinal cord and they're going to come and join the spinal nerve. So a spinal nerve is considered as a mixed nerve, has a sensory section and has a motor section. The sensory part is going to come from peripheral, is going to come to a spinal nerve, and then it's going to take the back door to get inside the spinal cord. But the order that comes from the spinal cord is going to take from the anterior and is going to take the front route to get to the spinal nerve. Technically, a spinal nerve is from here to here. This posterior one is called posterior root, and this anterior one is called anterior root. So spinal cord, we say, divide in two roots, posterior and anterior. Posterior contains sensory information and the anterior contains motor information. Also realize that anterior root or posterior root, before attaching to a spinal cord, they're going to branch off and it's going to create something that's called rootlet. So these are posterior rootlet, these are anterior rootlet. In this picture, all of this yellow structure that's coming between the vertebrae is your spinal nerve, these ones. How many spinal nerve do we have? We have 8 cervical spinal nerve, 8 of them, C1 to C8. We have 12 thoracic spinal nerve. We have 5 lumbar spinal nerve, 5 sacral spinal nerve, and we have 1 coccygeal spinal nerve that doesn't show as a name here, but this is supposed to be this one. Let's take a look at this picture. We have 8 cervical spinal nerve. We have 12 thoracic spinal nerve. We have 5 lumbar spinal nerve. We have 5 sacral spinal nerve, and we have 1 coccygeal. I have to remind you that spinal column has only 7 vertebrae. Please take a look at this picture. This is your spinal column. We have only 7 vertebrae of the cervical region, but we have 8 cervical nerve. Don't forget that. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and we have 12 thoracic spinal nerve. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and we have 5 spinal nerve in the lumbar region. We have only 1 sacrum, but we have 5 sacral spinal nerve. We have only 1 coccyx, and we have 1 coccygeal nerve. So I want to emphasize, many students are confused about this one. A spinal column is one thing, a spinal nerve is another thing. For instance, yes, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and we have 12 thoracic spinal nerve. Yes, we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and we have 5 lumbar spinal nerve. But that is not true about cervical region. In the cervical region, we have 7 vertebrae, but we have 8 nerve. In the sacral, we have only 1 sacrum, but we have 5 sacral nerve. In the coccyx, we have 1 coccyx, and we have 1 coccygeal nerve. This brings us to a very important point. As you can see in this picture, the first cervical nerve, which is called C1, it comes from the top of the cervical vertebrae. So this is the first cervical vertebrae, and C1 is on the top of this one. With the same token, the C2 nerve, it's come out from above C2 vertebrae. This is C2 vertebrae, and C2 is going to be above this one. Why this one is important? Because if you want to block, let's say, a spinal nerve C4, where do you put your needle? Let's say this is the vertebrae number 4 in the cervical region. If you want to block the cervical nerve number 4, do you put your needle here on top of the 4th vertebrae, or do you put your needle here at the bottom of 4th vertebrae to block C4 nerve? Well, the answer is you have to put it on top of this one, because remember, your spinal nerve comes from the top of the vertebrae. So C1 comes from the top of C1, and C2 comes from the top of C2. Therefore, C3 comes from the top of C3, and C4 is going to get out from above C4. That continues all the way we go to the C7. So that's my C7. If I want to block spinal nerve C7, I have to put my needle above C7. But remember, we have 1 extra spinal nerve in the cervical region, and that is called C8. So therefore C8 is going to come out from the bottom of the C7. So if I want to block C8, I have to put my needle below C7. Does it make sense? Remember, we have only 7 vertebrae, but we have 8 spinal nerve. So therefore C8 would be at the bottom of the C7. That means this is my T1 vertebrae. Now my T1 nerve is going to come from the bottom of T1. In other words, from thoracic down, if you want to block a nerve, you have to put your needle at the lower part of that vertebrae. For instance, if you want to block T5, this is my T5, I have to put my needle at the bottom of this vertebrae. So one more time, in the cervical region, if you want to block a nerve, you have to put your needle at the top of that vertebrae. If you want to block C3, you have to put your needle above C3. If you want to block C6, you have to put your needle above C6 vertebrae. But in the thoracic down, if you want to block T4, you find your vertebrae T4 and then you put your needle under that. I think that's a very important clinical point that you have to consider.